Welcome. I'm Russell Panchenko, the director of the Chazen Museum, and it's always my pleasure to welcome people to our exhibitions, to our openings, our talks, and whatever, so we're delighted to have you all here. Where unfortunately, Steve and Pamela Hootkin, who had the vision for this collection and spent a couple of decades putting it together, can't be here. On the other hand, they're probably listening to us right now as this is being streamed on the internet live, and anywhere in the country, as long as you tune in, you'll find this and everything will be available to it. It's a whole new technology. I'm a little old for it, but I'm getting used to it. I can see the excitement about it, but I need some of these young people to let me understand what the possibilities might be. So anyway, we're delighted that the collection is here. We're delighted that the Hootkins have shared it with us. And as you may know, all of our exhibitions and collections are here primarily for teaching purposes. Yes, the quality and the importance of the artwork is very important to us, but it's the teaching ability that comes from it. And we're very fortunate to have numerous departments with whom we interact. And so this evening's panel discussion, I'm going to turn over to Paul Sacaridiz, who's professor in the Department of Art, a wonderful artist in his own right, specialist with ceramics, and the chair of the department at present time. He knows a lot more about this material than I do. Paul, it's all yours.
Thank you, Russell. Can you all hear me all right? Good? Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight, and it's arguable if I know more about this than Russell does, but I'll take that compliment for now. So it's a total pleasure to be here with these panelists, and I'm going to open up the discussion tonight with a brief introduction to try to put this collection into a bit of context and to provide a little bit of background how I've been thinking about this show. And I've had the pleasure over the past number of weeks to spend a tremendous amount of time in this show. I was able to talk with the docents. I've given tours to numerous groups. I've talked about it in and out of the museum, and it's occupied quite a bit of my thinking at home and away. And I think it's just a fantastic opportunity to be able to talk about this work with you all today. So the show that brought us together here, the Stephen and Pamela Hootkin collection of contemporary ceramic sculpture, and it's a very particular name, and I'm going to get to why I think that's important in a moment, offers us an extraordinary view into a private collection. And that private collection is one that I think is marked by generosity, wonder, and ultimately, in its current manifestation, the desire to share this work with the public. And I know for our students, it's an extraordinary and remarkable opportunity. Outside of that, I would say that over the past decade, if not a bit more, in America, ceramics has gained perhaps an unheard of acceptance within the contemporary art world. And it has what I would consider a critical foothold right now. It's being talked about in ways that has not been talked about before. It is being collected in ways that has not been collected before. And in general, I would say the discourse around ceramics has risen to an entirely new level. And for one generation of artists, this has become the norm. For another generation of artists, even not that far beyond them, in some ways, that is a very new moment. And so I'd like to posit that this exhibition is in some ways the bridge between what we understand now and what came before it. So I've titled these brief thoughts, On the Way to Something Else. And the way that we position ceramics, or indeed the way we position anything, has to do with how it's framed. And how it's framed often has to do with how it's remembered, how it's been written about, or in this case, photographed. This peculiar moment, which is probably the most overused image in the history of ceramic education, but I'm going to use it one more time because it's a good one, is what has been mythologized as the most famous meeting of ceramicists. And so who you have here is Hamada, of my head, always perhaps. Peter Volkes, standing next to him in the button-down shirt. A very young Rudy Audio next to him. Bernard Leach, the kind of grandfather of pottery from England. And Soetsu Yanagi, who is the philosopher from Japan. And the three of them, Yanagi, Hamada, and Leach, were on tour, so to speak. And they were moving around the United States in an attempt to understand ceramics in this country and also bridge a gap between East and West, as it was talked about. It's an incredibly romantic idea. It played out with great mythology, and it was undoubtedly one of the most important events in some ways in this country in terms of ceramics. And so the place this photograph is taken is also critically important. You would not know that unless I tell you, but the brick wall in the background, that if you've been there, you would know it immediately. This is the Archie Bray Foundation, which is in Helena, Montana. If you've ever been to Helena, Montana, it's not exactly the epicenter of all crossroads. It's a bit out there. Imagine at this point in time, this is 1950s, it was a little bit more out there. So the fact that these three men from all points of the world arrived at that place to talk with these two young people in what was at the time a brick factory run by a man named Archie Bray. The brick factory was on its way out economically, and Archie had the foresight to let these two guys who were working in the pottery, recently back from the war, GI Bill, work there and make ceramics. It was perhaps the worst business plan one could ever imagine for a failing business, but lo and behold, in this day and age, I returned from there this summer from a meeting. It is a thriving art center now that supports ceramic artists and has for many, many years. So this confluence of these individuals there was truly historic. And I love that there's a pot on the table. And in a way, I think that pot is very, very symbolic as Rudy Audio and Pete Volkus are kind of in the chasm between Bernard and Hamada. Because what came next did not look like that pot. And what came next was what has been referred to academically, romantically, nostalgically as the clay revolution. So it was the moment at which ceramics was blown up from that pot and turned into this thing. And I use thing deliberately. We didn't know what this was. People looking at this work didn't know what this was. People began, specifically a small group of people, began using clay in ways that had not been used. It was thicker than it should be. It was on the floor. It was pounded out. It was stamped on, trampled, punched. You get the point. At the time, abstract expressionism is taking place in New York. These two artists are beginning, and their general generation are beginning to look at the contemporary art world and asking questions about how working with a material such as ceramics could begin to interface with that. And the work that it resulted in was remarkable. It was also incredibly macho. It was dominated by men, and you would think, they were in California at this point, that there were no women living in the state of California working in ceramics. And there perhaps were one or two, but somehow when the photo shoots happened, they were never around. But here you can see this image. And I say all this a bit tongue-in-cheek. I both have incredible reverence for this work. I think we all do. And it's also as problematic as it is wonderful. Note the stance, arm bent, tool in one hand, vertical object, right? All this follows a certain kind of repetition. But it's incredibly important history. And it's history that has recently been revisited quite a bit. Specifically through a series of exhibitions that took place called Pacific Standard Time about a year and a half ago in California that was documenting LA art. And the historical importance of that exhibition and project is that it re-looked at this work in ways that it had not been done before. This pause is for us to wait 60 or so years until we hit now. So the narrative that work helped us to construct, and the narrative and the practice that work then yielded, I would argue, was what became known as the American craft movement. This was specifically work happening in the United States. They were artists who grew out of educational programs, academic programs, studio practices that were using clay and that built a series of institutions, collections, and in general ways of working with the material that took ceramics out of a strictly utilitarian base and opened it up into a much wider dialogue. The works in the Hootkin collection, which I would argue is an incredibly extraordinary collection, Not only is it generous, the Hootkins have exceptional taste. This work is so consistently outstanding. My colleagues included who are here. And I think that what that work allows us to do is it problematizes how we think about ceramics. It asks questions about what ceramics can be, and it provides other generations with the ability to produce work like this. So this is Nicole Cherubini. Arlene Chichet. Jessica Jackson Hutchins. None of these works are in the collection, and that's not the point. I don't think they should be in the collection. The point of the collection is that it has framed out a moment in time, and it has crystallized it for us in these galleries, for us to then be able to understand works that come after it. Not in a hierarchical sense, but literally in how do we understand this, or how do we understand this work? This is Francesca D'Amato, born in 1982, with Peter Volkes and that group who are bashing pots apart. One could say they're similar, one could say they're completely different, but I would argue you can't understand one gesture without the other. So I would say the work in the exhibition upstairs, it really asks questions about how we understand an object. And it would be easy to say that sculpture is that which is not useful, but I think that's actually too simplistic. And I would argue that sculpture is the thing that has an ability to be the thing that other things are not, in a very powerful way. And I'm going to end with a quote from the English sculptor Tony Cragg. And he wrote that sculpture belongs to a rare and extraordinary class of things. Rare because even just looked at quantitatively, very few kilograms of sculpture are made on an average day, while many billions of tons of materials are made into other more useful things. Extraordinary because although sculpture remains for the greater part useless, unlike designed objects, it's an attempt to make dumb material express human thoughts and emotions. It is the attempt not just to project intelligence into materials, but also to use materials to think with. And so I can't think of 4 people that use materials to think with any better than these 4. I'm not going to read you a formal introduction of their resumes. You can look those up. But what I'm going to do is mention each of them briefly, and then they're going to show images of their work, and we'll open up into a discussion. I couldn't have had a better dream team of thinking about artists, and there's personal reasons why I adore each of them. But this is the work of Anne Agee, to my side here. Anne's based in New York. And Anne Agee's work has the beautiful ability to think about the decorative arts in ways that perhaps we haven't thought of them before. And I've known of Anne's work for many, many years, and I've always enjoyed her conversations, and also having a chance to be in an exhibition together a few years ago. John Roloff, who's based in the California Bay Area, whose work as a person growing up in ceramics, as I like to call it, his work was incredibly influential, specifically these pieces as ghost ships, as well as these larger kiln works where John took the logic of firing an object in a kiln and kind of inverted it and used the kiln as the object. I think it was revolutionary and groundbreaking work. Judy Moonelis, who again, when I think back on my own experience in ceramics, this piece and another one that's up in the collection is one of the more iconic works that I can think of from the period of time that this was made. And I think her work is haunting in both its elegance and beauty and rawness, and also the psychological implications that it carries. And then Beth Cavener, who is someone I've known for a number of years, and I think that Beth's work also absolutely extraordinary. She uses the material with both an aggressiveness and an elegance that I think is rarely seen. And she truly does the kind of unimaginable in making objects that when we see them, we're not asking how they were made, but instead we're somehow trying to understand ourselves through them. So I'd like to introduce each of these artists now, and they're going to show images of their work, and then we'll open it up into a discussion. So Anne.
Okay. So this is on. Okay. So you have talked about ceramics in relation to sculpture, which I think is interesting because I began as a painter. I went to school for painting, and in my second year of graduate school, I had begun to work with clay. And I wanted to deal with the function. So I wasn't looking for the purity of an autonomous object. I was trying to bring in something utilitarian to my painting. Now I'm going to skip to many years later. This is an installation of work that was at the Philadelphia Art Museum. I was given the opportunity to work in a period room, and I chose this kitchen. If you can imagine this room with white walls, it was just plaster walls, and it's an old Pennsylvania kitchen, like 18th century, beautiful woodwork, but kind of simple for my eyes, and it was full of like candle making equipment, weaving, spinning. There's a cradle in the back, big pots, and I was struck by all the work that would go on in the kitchen. And I went down the hallway and was equally struck by the Robert Adams Lansdowne drawing room, which was decorated with the most incredible paint and gilding and relief and silk-covered chairs and little dainty couches and stuff. And I wanted to bring together work and beauty, and so I made wallpaper of that one room. And I put these kind of riffs off of vases I found in a thrift store, and repeats of certain vases. I think as a painter, I had decided while I was at school that painting was limited for me, and I realized, being surrounded by painters, that I hadn't really grown up with my parents buying painting or putting painting on the wall. I'd grown up really surrounded by other visual, domestic stuff. My mother was always making, making stuff out of stuff she found, or I remember a great trip to buy wallpaper with her and the horror of putting it up and realizing it was wrong and too bad, we had to live with it. But those were the kind of visual things that really got to me after a while. So I moved my painting to clay, and then I became really interested in clay. And so I worked with, later, the clay work just became white, sort of more like drawings. This is from 2012, part of an installation at Locke's Gallery. I also began repeating my work. So I was looking at figurines and things that I think of as marketed towards people who lived at home and marketed to people who would dress up their homes, so women. This piece I made, all the work I did as figurines, inspired by figurines that were made by slip casting, and I made mine by hand building, and I made repeats of them. There was often the subject of country pastoral. This piece, my children told me about their babysitter and what happened at the babysitter's with her horse, and the gynecologist came to check on the ovaries, and I couldn't believe how wonderful that was. So that's how that piece came about. But I also am interested in the whole history of industrial ceramics, from porcelain, fine china, and toilet making. I worked at Kohler for a while in the residency there. So I wanted to include as much as I could in that, in this. So there's a sink there, and there are other figurines and other things that would be made. And I have often been as a child, I remember being really turned on by shiny ceramic things. Always remember all the dishes we had, got really interested. I even asked my parents for something that was ceramic for Christmas one year, which I can't believe. It was so ugly, but I wanted it. So yeah, just looking at painting in museums, and then looking at everything else, ceramics. And the Met is a wonderful place, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and looking at the way that collections, somebody's dishes were as important to them as their paintings. That wasn't really taught to me in school, but you could see it in museums. And the collections of dishes would be displayed kind of separately, but kind of like that in a sort of decorative way. So this is my dishes with a pattern, and this is the unmade bed. This is another piece, a smaller one, and I've hung it on some of the wallpaper kind of work. This is another piece like that. Installation. I have to go faster.
You're doing okay.
Okay. This piece here was also on that table, but it's hidden because I think my dealer didn't understand why it was on the table. But I made this actually I was in my studio, I was getting ready to finish up all the work I was doing for my show in 2012. And I had taught myself how to use the wheel to make certain parts, and it just took off. I could make the figure on the wheel. That was really exciting. So I was over by the telephone in this communal space, and there was a Peter Voulkos catalog, and I had kind of ignored him my whole life, and I looked at it and thought, wow, some of this is made on the wheel. Some of these big sculptures are made on the wheel. And I turned around, went back to my little space, and looked at the stuff that was laying around and made this leftover. That's very small. It's like 13 inches maybe. And after the show, nobody said very much about it. After the show, I lived with it in the front hallway and just loved it more and more. So I switched over to, this is quite tall. This is almost my height, stoneware and Japanese glaze. Like, whoa! Really out there. There's a whole bunch of them. And here they are again. More of them. And this is made of urethane from a mold. And here's some porcelain pieces and some rubber pieces that actually jiggle. And there's a kind of copy of a Mycen piece. It's all made on the wheel and chopped up. There's a frame. Okay, so I'm kind of all over the place now between the abstract work and the more figurative work. And so I decided I needed a guidebook. And I was going to work it out for myself, how I could get back and forth. So this is the beginning of a book. I'm working on it. This is in Tamil. It says Guidebook, Agee Manufacturing Company, Souvenir Division. And this is several languages. This is the dress I made that one might wear to sell the guidebooks at the Javits Center or something like that. That's printed on old bed linens. And this is a bathroom. This is a copy I made of a bathroom I made at Kohler Company in 1992. And this is also ongoing work. I just finished it this summer. And that's going to be in the guidebook. Somehow I need to get from the abstraction to this and back and forth and just open up, expand my possibilities. And that's my studio. There we go.
Hello. Move to the next. I tried to assemble a short segment of slides that span a long period of time, but are hopefully give a context to the works that are in this show. Primarily the ship image and some of the history from my perspective of how important it's been to me. So this is there was a time it's called the Exile series. I was teaching at University of Kentucky, and I felt I was in exile from California. So anyway, there was a whole series of tableaus, and you can see that these are very landscape-like. I was also very influenced by landscape painting, or painting in general, rather than sculpture and rather than figuration, but more of a kind of pictorial or horizontal sort of view of things. And this is an example of, there were many different scales. This was a full size, that was actually me, that a mold was taken off of to make this kind of coral rowboat-like work. And then things, by the end of the 70s, things were becoming more and more experimental. In particular, the kiln as an agent. And so a lot of the things that I was putting in the kiln had to do with setting up situations where the kiln wasn't just there to make the thing hard or to put a glaze on the surface to make it shiny or something. It was meant to collapse or to alter. I saw it as a kind of voyage into another temperature. And I also had a long background in geology before I was involved in art in the 60s. So this idea of materiality and change and process became very important to me. This particular work is actually something that's unfired clay that's been sheathed in black cement, with the idea that the history of cement involves a firing process back as it becomes from limestone to cement. So I felt that it already had been fired, and the idea of metaphorically firing the clay that was inside of this structure that was around some palm fronds was a way of addressing that, or a way of trying to move in another direction. This piece is actually kind of an odd, I was surprised that the work that was a monitor series is actually in the Hootkin collection. I'd lost track of most of those. But this is a large work that I did, and one of the things that I was always doing in my process was to work at a large scale and then at a studio scale. And so that dialogue back and forth of landscape back to studio was always very important in terms of generative ideas, relationship to materials and things like that. So this actually was the piece that was killed like a membrace pot. I poked each one of those things, and now it's under the mud someplace in San Francisco Bay. These are a series of night ships, and they're part of they're the group basically that one of the Hootkin pieces has, the mined hull. And it's a series that was pretty much a culmination of working with a particular mold at a particular scale, so that size. There were probably 40 or some odd number of pieces that size, and also the one that has the number Untitled number 79 is an earlier version of this group, and there was a whole range of those things. And you can kind of see the relationship in a way of these objects to landscape. I would find ships of another sort in the landscape, and sometimes they become photo works. The idea of, particularly if you lived in the West Coast, the idea of the Western Cordelia, which is a assemblage of terrains that was actually constructed the landscape in geologic time. So these fragments of land came in through plate tectonics and constructed the landscape. To me, those were ships in a sense, the same way that these elements, like in Mono Lake, and the bottom part of this was a ship, and the upper image obviously was one of the clay ships. Also at that time were these kiln projects where the idea of, when I was in grad school, I realized I saw this salt kiln. It was a really old kiln, And it had bricks that were kind of, as kilns get fired, they expand and contract, and so they get looser and looser, particularly if it was homemade and the structure holding it together was not complete. So anyway, there was flames coming out of this kiln, and I realized that that's the juice. This is where the action is that the firing, and that the things that came out of it were essentially residue. So then that was and it took me from grad school, which was in 72 and 3, until 1979 when I did a workshop at University of Notre Dame to actually start to implement that idea in the landscape. Before that, it had been what I was describing as the alteration of the object in the kiln. So these are now, and pulling in geologic materials in situ, they're bringing in the idea of site-based things. I would do research on the geologic history of a site as well as a Native American history of a site, thinking that they knew that land way more than anything that I would bring to it. So the idea of research, the idea of that site language and earthworks were all kind of infused in this body of work. And this is a particular work that was in Detroit in 1984. So these now had really become performances, and the idea the next day, this is one day, one evening of firing. Next day there was something inside, but in some sense the object was more the critical part. Then a series of other works that sort of brought the landscape in different ways, like the ship continuing on as in this work as a symbol for the process of deposition. The idea of landscape being made continually through geologic deposition of sedimentary materials. So inside of this ship is actually water and sediment from Pyramid Lake that was shipped out to Washington, D.C., and there's a misting system in there, and the light from the window was meant to be a kind of test tube, the same way that a kiln was a test tube. Like when you open it, you don't really know what you're going to get. And for me, I would try to make it so that I didn't know, or I only knew it in a certain way, and it would be a surprise. So that kind of attitude was infused in these other works in different ways. And this work, Metafossil, each of the ships is now refractory cement, which is what used to make some of the kilns, has a pine boughs from different species, each a separate species in the surface, and they will eventually decay and leave a fossil of that. So that was another analog that I explored in the ceramic works, is when you dip organic material in clay and then fire it, that organic material burns out. So it's essentially the fossilization process, which might take 1,000 years or whatever. It was done in 48 hours or something. So these are all analogs to these processes that I was exploring. This particular ship is a public artwork that has sediment taken from 4 miles off the coast of California. And actually there are seeds that I didn't know about latent in there, so it became a terrarium. And since 1993, it's still alive. There's a water misting system in there that was meant to be able to control condensation, but it ended up becoming an irrigation system. So another work, fairly recent, with the ships is at the show that Paul and I were in at the Denver Art Museum. And it was, anyway, these are the material that the ship has from the mold. It's a wooden mold, is actually taken from the landscape, and it's a rammed earth process of sediments that are in chronological order. And now these other works, these photographic works that represent a whole bunch of other ideas related to architecture and the land and sea as a kind of analog to each other, are also part of this piece. And there are 4 other photos in different parts of the museum, also at a fairly large scale. And then most recently, there's a work from the last NCCA conference where this is sediment from Wisconsin, but southeastern Wisconsin, so a little bit below here. And this was, I never did find the name of the actual contractor, but it was Paul found a contractor that would dig up some, this was in March when the ground was frozen. So I wasn't thinking,
You were not.
How was I going to get that
It's
stuff?
a lot of phone calls.
So anyway, this was a work that had to do with the change that occurred during the Pleistocene, and so the idea of it being glacial till, or material that had to do with that time period, and sort of the offsets and structural things about the work were part of that idea. And then this is some very recent work. These are proposals for the Exploratorium. I worked for 4 years on a number of different grants for projects there that involve a kind of deep sourcing of the materials that the piers, where the piers in San Francisco were made of. And so that generated a whole series of new works. And then just some exploratory CAD drawings for things for a gallery exhibition. And then most recently, we're going back to making some clay works, but the clay is very special. The clay, I basically kind of snuck in, and I found out where they were augering deep down to put in pilings for freeway. So this is from, it's important for me that it be a little deeper than just very superficial stuff, that it come from another time period. So this from about 20 feet deep is bay mud, and it makes a beautiful clay. So the idea now for me is where the materials come from are really special in terms of this whole vocabulary and how to generate a new body of work. So thanks.
Get my two things out. So first, this works? Okay, good. I just want to say in advance that I'm sorry if I start coughing. I do have a cold, and I'm trying to monitor it with liquids and cough drops, so I'll do my best. So I'm going to take you on a wild, fast tour through a lot of work, and this is Inversion, a piece based on the human bronchial tree. It's about 3 feet tall. And this is quite a departure from what you see representing my work in the exhibition. And that was my intention, is to bring you on a kind of wild tour through what's happened since, as well as some early understanding of where it comes from. But the role of research and invention is very important to me. And here you can see the piece that you just saw, a lot of anatomical studies, and that's the actual bronchial tree, a photograph of one. And it's very remarkable to me to understand the beautiful universe within us and within all living species, and that's become a very strong subject in my work. Early works, I started life off as a painter, and this was a sort of seminal early piece for me where I pinned tiny little self-portraits on a daily basis, or every once in a while, and then for days and not again, to the wall. And here we go. And what I really appreciated was not the individual paintings themselves, but this kind of the interaction of these different images and this kind of puzzling that started to happen. So representing an idea through many fragments as opposed to only a single image became something of interest. And I started trying to represent this idea first in clay. These are about 3 feet tall, and this is two sides of the same piece. It's a single standing sheet of clay called a slab, and highly colored and slips, etc. And these were very sort of simple duality pieces, one thing going on one side and one on another, and expressing different notions of an internal, external kind of tension, or the contrast between what's inside and outside of us. This piece here as well. So these are some of the things in the show that you'll see now that represent ideas about the complexities of relationships. And you mentioned earlier, Paul, the idea of the kind of macho thing. This was my macho period. I was really making big stuff for a while, and I needed to do that. And the Brickyard on the left in Omaha, and on the right in my own studio, a work in progress where I was starting to paint once fire, they call it, where you paint directly on the dry clay. And, this was another one of those giant pieces. And what happened here that interests me now is that the structural aspect of this woman in bed piece, which was about a little taller than life size, the structural aspect that you see on the left actually became a kind of housing for these small fragments. And it's the fragment that really interests me to this day. The body started getting involved. This is a large wall piece made of clay, and mostly female torsos without heads, arms, etc. Some of the more expressive parts, but all kind of using the human body as a kind of means to express ideas. And here, this is a very small detail of a very large wall project, kind of meditation on loss. And the top left, you see a piece that's in this show. It was a small part of a very large piece. And at this time, I started exploring a lot of different materials. There's lead bodies and paper and all kind of bronze and copper and such. These are pinched clay feet, part of the continuation of the fragment as a way to talk about ideas, and feet on various grounds that were unstable. The portrait is something that's always interested me and continues to from my painting days, but also just in general, the idea that the head is a kind of locus and a place where a lot is stored and communicated. And the memory portrait series I started on the right, I met many, many people in various residencies that I was doing, and they sat for portraits. And during the portrait sessions, I asked them a question about memory. Where did they feel memory resided in their body? What were their thoughts about memory in general? And people said remarkable things, and I wrote down quotes from their comments about this, and they're inscribed in the head. So that was the beginning of a concept or an idea about taking pieces from conversation and including them in a kind of portrait. These are touch portraits, and I did a series based on the idea of the sense of touch and sensory, the importance of the sensory organs, and the idea that we are very much we describe our world and we feel our world through the senses. And sense of touch was one of the explorations I did. But here, the portrait or the human head is very small in relation to the microscopic representations of microscopic structures in our bodies called touch receptors. So it was an inverted relationship. The very small became large and the large became small. But the relationship here again, the bronchial tree, it represented in a different way. I was really interested in the way what's inside of our body is reflected in the external world and vice versa. So the branching systems that exist in nature and within us are remarkable. So this was a large room installation. This is a detail of these suspended clay forms with actual branches, and looking at the circulatory system and the various structures within our body that also have the branching. And the branching image here, one of my primary resources for the following piece was the, excuse me, this very wonderful first time Darwin's Tree of Life was depicted by him. It's a tiny little drawing that he did to represent this very large idea. The sketchbook, I saw this on the internet and I didn't have any idea the scale of the image, but when I saw the actual sketchbook, it's about 3 inches tall, this whole sketchbook. It's tiny. And I just thought it was so beautiful that represented this large change in the way we saw the world. So this piece is about that idea. It's about evolution and teaching of evolution. It was first shown in Kansas, where teaching of evolution was under there was a lot of discussion and controversy over that, especially then. And there's human hair and looking at humans' place in the evolutionary chain. I've become especially interested in the neural world and brain science, and I like to look at historic images as well as contemporary ways of representing ideas. And here on the left, you see Cajal's most magnificent drawing of some of the earliest representations of neurons he was a scientist, and these are direct observations. And on the right, more contemporary ways that we have of imaging these things. So branching systems are everywhere. And this is one of my earlier efforts to represent ideas about the brain, and this is mirror neuron strands, looking at the idea of mirror neurons, something that they're questioning a lot these days, but also the concept just in general of how our brains and the way we think and the universe that is within us is also external. I had the opportunity, and as did two of my panelists here, to work on an interaction site-specific project, and this was at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, a historic site. And whoops, that went faster than I thought. But anyway, they had solitary confinement was the method used there, and this one is called Brain Cell, and it was an installation inside this historic site, and this one was Blood Cell, based on the circulatory system in the woman's laundry, or the former's woman's laundry, connection between the bodies. And here, this was in a former bank vault that was turned into an art center in Westchester, and I had the opportunity to make a piece in the vault. And working with sites is really exciting to me, and something that I find I interact with the work in new ways. So here I found the original safe deposit boxes in this space and used them in the work. And you can see those, many of them are flipped open. And this was one of those last-minute decisions that happened on the spot. I didn't even know the boxes were there. So I had the whole piece planned and then found the boxes and totally revamped the piece. But this piece is called Wonder, and this was made to look at the way, the kind of interconnections between species. And this is a picture, a very important picture by Rosalind Franklin. It's called photo number 51. It's a crystallography picture of DNA double helix that allowed Watson and Crick to prove that it was a double helix. And she's not credited enough with this discovery, and I always like to bring her in. But I'm also working a lot with DNA-related concepts, and this is called Cellular Networks, an installation I did last year, where looking at Hurricane Sandy and the effects of seeing what happens when we wipe out some of our cellular technology and how lost we all are suddenly without electricity was really amazing to me. And I felt interested in looking at the idea of our cellular connections between all of us living things, and also the way digital and technological advances are changing the way our world is, and us. And this is details of that piece. This is what I'm doing now. This is my DNA wheel, and I've just changed studios. So on the left is where I started the piece, and on the right is where I'm going with my little amino acid structures, etc. So, and shadows. So there you go. Okay. I'm gonna
Hi, my name is Beth Cavener, and instead of taking you through a brief history, I just wanted to address some of the pieces that are here in the collection. I am a real storyteller, so I knew if I showed too many images, we'd be here for another 4 hours. So briefly, I just wanted to say that most of my work is based off of the human mind and the human experience. I used to work figuratively with the human body, but I found that I could be much more sneaky and subtle by disguising the human body inside of an animal skin. So in graduate school, I started sculpting portraits of people in complete darkness, and I did 300 of these studies in the shapes of animals, but encompassing characters and emotional states and psychological states that I wanted to capture about what it meant to be a human being. Since then, most of my work has continued on in that direction, taking these psychological snapshots. This piece is called Olympia. At this point in my career, I was interested in tackling issues that I found deeply uncomfortable, namely sexuality. I'm a very repressed person. and so when I kept getting comments from people that my work was very sexual in nature, and I would be very uncomfortable with the fact that they were seeing that in the work. So I thought, well, okay, let's tackle this head on. So I started making work about my discomfort with sexuality, and this piece was about how I wanted to be viewed as attractive, as sensual, but was afraid of that gaze from other people and of returning it. So in homage to the Manet painting of Olympia as this very powerful sexual woman, I've stripped myself of that gaze and presented myself as vulnerable to it instead. And the most recent work that I've done, the last show I did called Come Undone at the Claire Oliver Gallery in 2012, I have continued working from this real personal narrative, but expanding it into a broader sense. I wanted to take that idea of questioning who one is, especially in how you relate to others in a relationship particularly. So I was obsessed with the idea of a question mark for a period of time. And these two studies, these are two little clay maquettes that I made, were based off the idea of a question mark and of questioning how it was that I interacted both in positive and negative ways with other people. So in this particular piece called The Question That Devours, sort of addresses that need to control, to own, to possess, to devour another person and make them yourself, a part of yourself rather than letting them be autonomous. And this piece is a large wall piece, so it's that wolf is about the size of my own body in terms of scale. And then the upside down question mark representing that need to nurture. So it's a different side of possessing, but this was the transformation of that question mark into the sentimental question with the figure contained within like that. So in this show, taking that question mark and splitting it and fragmenting it into different, more nuanced questions became sort of the focus of that body of work. And those two pieces led to this piece called L'amante, which means the lover. So instead of taking the destructive forces of possession and jealousy and wanting to subsume another into yourself, I wanted to revisit Olympia and return her gaze to her. So I would say almost 15 years later in my life, wanting to project that confidence that I felt that I was missing. And so L'amante has both the gaze of a predator and a prey. Most predator animals have their eyes focused forward in front of their face, and most prey animals search to the sides, outside of themselves. And so L'amante meets somewhere in between. She's both the viewer and the viewed. And she's covered, I should say, in a whole history of tattoos all over her body. It was a collaboration between me and Alessandro Gallo, who's my husband. And the tattoos cover sort of that whole transformation through Yakuza tattoos and imagery of becoming and unbecoming. The latest piece that was shown at the NCCA conference in Milwaukee in 2014 was another collaboration between me and Alessandro Gallo. And this piece was called Tangled Up in You. And this is a 22-foot-long python snake that was covered in the same sorts of imagery, taking you through the seasons of a person's life. And again, the snake is just a symbol for that internal twisting, self-doubt, and transformation that you undergo in order to be sort of a complete and utter person, I guess. But it's the snake is both part of and an external force, pushing itself onto this particular figure.
Well, thank you all. So I have a number of questions that I want to ask you, and I think I'm going to start with this one, which is that having spent time around this collection over the past few months, the show is started to make sense beyond any one individual piece, right? So I think the show as a whole is doing a number of different things. And I'm curious, from the perspective of artists that have worked in the show and have seen the show, if you could talk a little bit about ways that you might see the exhibition functioning either as a whole or in parts, or seeing your work in relation to other objects that you might not have formerly been aware of. A small question.
Well, I think it's, I think most of us here have had a relationship with the Hootkins in some way, and visited their home and seen these pieces and our own pieces becoming part of this growing collection. And it's having experienced it first in that environment where they were living with one another and literally cheek to jowl with other works, next to the sofa or in the kitchen or on the stairway. The sort of family that they created or the conversations that they created were really fascinating. And the fact that that the Hootkin saw in each one of these pieces a really essential, I don't know, deep human spirit, you know, in each of them, and that tied all the work together. That there was a real personal story behind each of them, and that, you know, they brought those pieces together was really interesting. But now seeing them in the museum recontextualizes them in a much different way, which I think allows them to breathe and become a larger story. I don't know. That's just sort of a really bland opening way of saying things, but. I'm going to pass the torch over there.
I can only say that it's very nice to see my piece stacked up, because it was always, I've been to their house a few times, and the piece was always in parts. I haven't looked at the collection that much, and I don't know, we were talking at lunchtime about this collection, and what did you ask us? What it meant, or what it was, or what it looks like, or what it feels like, or what is a personal collection? And my immediate feeling was just how overwhelming it was the first time I saw their collection. And you said, well, I guess I just felt kind of frightened by that much clay, that much ceramic, that much focus. And what did it feel like? I felt like it's, well, you said something. I said it's sort of like there were so many things missing, like the rest of the art world, the rest of art, or the rest of things going on. And you said, like, somebody who's eaten all the green M&Ms, which I thought was great. So it is nice to see it in an art museum with, I mean, I really loved seeing that modernist sculpture today that was mixed in with your work right around the corner from David Smith, and that was very beautiful. And I think it's really nice to see it in a larger context.
But as you were saying over lunch, the work was made in that context. I mean, we're all painters and drawers and stuff, like artists in a more general sense. So, you know, so as you were saying over lunch, like these objects in the collection were made with all these different backgrounds and different influences coming into the work. But when it was just contextualized with other ceramics, it lost some of that broader context. So it's wonderful to see it sort of expanding back out again and pulling in all those different things.
Yeah. But it's also really amazing to see the portrait of the Hootkins, which that's what it is, kind of. And that's kind of amazing. Here.
Yeah, following that a little bit, I've seen a number of different collections, you know, by other collectors, and usually when they're given a tour, you get the sense of like where they started and then where they went, and you see a vision unfold. I don't know the Hootkins well enough to know that. I mean, I could probably analyze the show and see the dates and probably piece together something like that. But the idea of people many, particularly ceramic collectors, at least to my knowledge, start out with passion, that they just find something that they're really interested in, and then it's a learning curve. They learn about what's out there, and then they start seeing it. And so you see this trajectory, and that's what's really interesting as part of that portrait, if in fact that was their case, where a museum collection might have more to do with an art historian, a curator sort of looking at a field and saying, okay, here's certain things, and here's, you know, our budget, here's all these different conditions, and it's a more, it has a different sort of methodology. And so that's what's interesting to me when I see an individual collection, is to sort of think about it in those terms.
I think all these are great comments, and I would add that it's also like framing history, and I think we're looking at a really nice kind of section of time, and it feels like great examples from that time. And it, I know in my own case, I'm looking back at a body of work that I barely recognize, and it's kind of like, wow, that was my work at that point, you know? But I also appreciate the quality of the overall collection and the intensity of their passion, and it's felt in the rooms, you know, that there's clearly true love here going on between the collectors and the things, the objects that they have acquired. But also, I think for all of us as artists, the transition of the work from the private collector's home to the public context is really lovely, and a sort of desired overall hope for work to end up in the public realm, and hopefully that will be the case with much of this work, so if not the whole collection.
Oh, none of you talked about what I thought you would talk about.
What did you think?
Well, you know, when I went through the exhibition, and there's so many layers to this, right? And we talked about this at lunch. You all should have been at lunch. It was very pleasurable. We kind of took care of the panel over lunch, but we didn't bring the cameraman with us. But over, you know, when there's the level of the work that you make, right? And what you made, as you said, you made this work I don't know if you said a lifetime ago, but what feels like some time ago. And there's what you do as an artist in your studio. There's the context that has informed the thing you're doing in your studio that has allowed you to make it, right? Like, I think one can say there's always kind of people that allow you to do what you do, right? In a sense of precedents or cultural things happening or artists, et cetera. So there are things happening and you made what you made. Someone was moved enough by that object to desire it, to want to live with it, to be challenged by it, to be detested by it, to be in love with it, to be all the reasons that we want something, right? And then they've accumulated these things. They put all the green M&Ms in the box, right? As Beth described, which I think is a great, we can nail collecting down to that. And, but then is that a completely idiosyncratic, haphazard, random, oh, I just want this and this and this and this, right? Or does something else, is there an undercurrent that's actually at play the whole time? And perhaps the one collecting can't ever answer that, or maybe they can. But when I walk through the show, and part of it is, I think, the brilliance of how it's laid out, and I was asked the question, well, how do you understand each room? And I hadn't really quite thought about that, but I was on the spot with a lot of people at the moment. And I thought, and I just kind of started talking, and suddenly it all made sense. You know, I think that that first room has everything to do with figuration and understanding a shift from kind of an external image of a figure to the internal struggle that might come out in your work, or Viola Fry's work, which is so imposing in scale and in surface and in, you know, it almost kind of pushes you out in a way. Whereas, Judy, I think your work kind of does exactly the opposite. It brings you into to having to kind of understand an object. Or I think there's other parts of the show, John, where your work is that had, for me, everything to do with the notion of monuments or monumentality. And memory through accumulation and striations. And your work, which is in, I think, one of the sweetest, and I use sweet in a particular way, room that is kind of painfully beautiful in thinking about memory and narrative and stories and objects that appear as one thing but deliver a message that's actually quite the opposite, right? Mm. So those are all the ways that I kind of saw the show working. And Beth's work, I think, has a really interesting way of operating in relation to Michael Lucero's work, which is, you know, in some ways comical, and your work is not. Right? I mean, your work has this edge of ha-ha, but followed by oh, right? And it's actually not funny. There's an aspect of your work that's disturbing, and you know, you use beauty in this. I was just talking about beauty recently with some business students, and I talked about beauty as the sucker punch, right? And it's a thing that, like, it pulls you in only to realize that actually this other thing is going on.
I've always, with my work, always liked the metaphor of a beautifully baited hook. You know, that I need that lure of the touch, you know, of the material and the way the body is presented in a very luscious, seductive way to draw you into a very uncomfortable conversation about an internal, you know, struggle, basically.
And do you feel a need to answer that question? Or that
No, I'm
the
just
work
asking.
needs to answer it? Right.
No, I just want to ask that question, and I think it's enough to ask other people to ask the question. I don't think it's ever an answer that you'll feel satisfied in coming to. It's a continual questioning and re-questioning. Hopefully more sophisticated as you go along.
Right.
Mhm.
So I think the materiality of ceramics is also kind of undeniable in that show, right? Because it's all ceramics.
Yes.
And which is both perhaps a challenge of like, where's the art world, but there's also a moment of, for me, in a kind of historian context, it's a really beautiful moment to understand how this material has been thought through and literally used to think with in that way. And so I'm curious what each of you, in your own way, thinks is specific to the material of ceramics that allows you to think with it. Like what is it that material allows you to do that perhaps another material wouldn't, or is it no different from any other material?
Well, I wanted to on this point, I wanted to take issue with Tony Craig in that I don't think it's intelligence being applied to dumb materials. I think it's really, for me, it's a very intelligent material. And I think that if you look at it from a geologic perspective, you start to see that more and more. And the idea of its place in the landscape, its place in the transition of materiality, you know, from feldspars to clay to then becoming another sedimentary material, becoming lithified and becoming slate or whatever process that you know, clay sort of, but it's part of this larger sort of cycle. And there's a new kind of philosophical sort of position that I'm really interested in. That's the next phase after deep ecology. And it's called OOO, and it's something, I'm trying to, Todd Moran, I believe, is the author, but it's about the idea that, because deep ecology has to do with everything that is sentient is on a level plane. In other words, all living things are non-hierarchical. This other thing brings in the idea that all things are on the same plane. So what that it does is it sort of equivocates this idea of intelligence into those materials that we sort of take of as being dumb. So those are that trajectory anyway is something that's really interesting to me, and I think that in different ways I've sort of intuited that, and I think it is because when you start with the landscape and then go to the material, those kinds of things are a little bit more apparent, even though you don't have a kind of a rational sort of way of describing that.
Judy, you looked like you were going to say something.
I think the idea was posited a while ago that all life began in clay. Scientists are debating this, and probably they don't agree with that anymore. But the notion that possibly that could have happened seemed completely believable to me. And it does seem like a material that has a kind of a life, in spite of it not being a living thing. And when one pushes against it, the physical response that the material itself has, I feel, for my own work, has certainly a kind of resonance that it allows me to speak. It's not the only material that does this, but it is certainly one of the primary ones. And the kind of fossil-like record that your fingerprint is recorded in that, a kind of we were here hand mark in the caves, but also the intelligence that our brain and our hand can connect, and that we can express something directly into a material, that there is nothing mediating between, that we can just push the clay and it moves, and then the process it goes through to fire and hard, etc. But there's something very important, and I think we were discussing this at lunch a little bit, this idea that we are more and more moving into a world where experience is mediated and there's not as much direct experience, that a video camera might be in between us and the actual experience. And I so appreciate the directness of this material, and it really does, sort of feed the maker as well as the viewer. So.
For me, it's the way that clay mimics both in all of its forms, both as a slip, as a wet body, as a dry, carvable body, then fired where it becomes stone. Like all these different processes that the material takes me through, have a physicality to it that relate to who I am and what I'm trying to say. In particular, I create a piece in maybe 2 or 3 days with a couple 1,000 pounds of clay on a metal armature. And then it takes me 3 to 4 months to hollow that piece out and reassemble it before it's fired. And so I spend far more time inside of my pieces than I do on the outsides. And while I'm inside of there, I'm pushing out the bellies and flaring the muscles and really giving sort of a liquid, breathable existence to what was once an angular sort of roughed-in shape. And that time that I spend inside of the form, I think, is apparent in a way that it wouldn't be if I couldn't do that with this material. So the fact that there's only a 1/4 inch of clay left over as this thin shell becomes a really beautiful process and metaphor for the external and internal life that I tackle in terms of my subject matter.
Do you think that's evident to anyone but you?
I think if you were to see a piece that was roughed in solid and then a piece that was hollowed out afterwards, you'd be able to see the difference, definitely. But these aren't pieces that could have been coil built or slab built. They're obviously, in my opinion anyway, built from a solid mass, and they retain that sense of massiveness. But the sort of joke is that most of them are so light that I can pick them up on my own, and they're just like a chocolate bunny, just a thin candy shell, and and inside is where I've haunted this space for a period of time, and I don't, I can't say with any kind of certainty that people can tell that I'm inside of there that much time, but I think that something about me living in that space is still evident. So,
There seems to be this trend right now, and I saw it in Los Angeles this summer at an exhibition where a lot of people are making something and then casting it in bronze. This is like the kind of the sculptural
Yes.
default right now. And it's not just because it's, well, actually, maybe that's exactly why, because that makes it real sculpture.
Yes.
But there's work that's made in cardboard, cast in bronze, painted to look like ceramic.
Yeah, or ceramic.
Right? And so Ricky Swallow is one person who's
Yeah.
done this, I think, in quite beautiful ways.
Yeah.
So I was with someone, and this friend who took me to this exhibition, and this person said, "Oh, I'm making this new work, and I'm going to cast it in bronze." And my friend could barely control himself in letting out, "Well, of course you are. You live in Los Angeles." And this person took this kind of offense at this notion. But I thought it was an interesting question. So would you, how would your work change if it wasn't, do you feel the work would change if it wasn't ceramic? I guess that's the question I'm asking, because so often with anything that's media specific, we get wrapped up in something that becomes pretty
Sure.
right? Like we make it in ceramic because we know that material, or we make a painting because we know how to paint, and those are fine things.
Right.
But I think in a moment where educationally and practice-wise there's a lot of talk of de-skilling, or what it means to work and not know how you do something, or what it means to have expertise, or academic departments that are getting rid of craft, or hiring people in craft who actually have no background in craft. This is I could cite certain people, not in a negative way. I actually think it's fascinating.
Right.
So I know one institution that hired someone with a background in fibers to teach in ceramics.
Wow. Yeah.
This person's doing very, very, very well in the marketplace, making ceramics that are very unskilled.
Well,
So-
I think a number of us, it sounded like, come from different backgrounds other than ceramics and came to clay specifically because there was something about that material that augmented the type of work we wanted to make. I mean, I came from a science background in physics and astronomy when I was an undergrad, and you were in painting, and so was Judy. I'm not sure, John, what your background was, if it was originally ceramics or not. Science.
Geology.
Yeah,
Yeah.
same here. And it's so, I mean, I wasn't formally trained in ceramics either, so it was, and the art background I did have was in bronze and casting in that very atelier European way. So, but when Judy and I were walking through the collection, we were noticing quite specifically that, there were, I don't know, there was one piece cast in bronze and one piece in ceramic by the same artist, and the one piece, the disabler bit,
Right.
the disabler piece had sort of a porosity and a breathability to it that had a real sense of sort of time and history and that archaeological, you know, feel to it, where the bronze just looked like a capital S sculpture. It looked like an artifact of this idea rather than being the actual, you know, fossil that was dug up, almost like it was the plaster cast of.
I would love to work in bronze. I have no problem with that.
It's
And
not.
It's money and it's access, and I
Right.
have to find out where to do it.
And who's going to pay for it?
Yeah, but it's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
easy to use my kiln because it's right there and the clay's there. I think that, yeah.
Have you had the chance to do it yet, or you have not? I mean, have you seen your work in bronze versus in clay?
I'm working with silk screen, and I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to make some really big thing in a space that's not big enough. And on paper, I think that if yeah, I would do it. It's just a matter of getting around to it. I made the pieces in rubber, which I really loved, and I could see making them bigger. And the piece, and just figuring out how to use the right kind of plastic or rubber or urethane. I'm really into doing my own work. I think that's sort of unusual in today's world when so much work is fabricated, or the idea of success is to get somebody else to do it. And I really like to make my work, so I hope that I will find the time to make I'd love to work with 3D printing. These are things on my list of things to do. And I think about other material a lot. I like the way, you know, old plastic rulers look, and what is that material? How would that look? You know, my sculpture's made out of that. I think about that. I should move to LA.
You would do really well, potentially. But so it was Roberta Smith recently, or a few years ago, but she's kind of been heralded for this statement a lot. People love to pull it out, that ceramics is the new video. She said this a few years ago, and it was, you know, written in the New York Times, and like people love to pull that quote. Like I love to pull that picture of Hamida and all those people together. And so I wonder if you, and her sense of that is that it's everywhere, right? It's all over.
Now the Portapack?
Low fire the Portapack?
I don't know. Does the analog
Yeah.
keep moving? What
Well-
would be the larger analog?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I think the examples she gives of ceramics being everywhere are actually incredibly analog. Right? So the work that she holds up as a critic of saying this work is everywhere. And in fact, we brought her to speak at NCECA, National Council of the Education Ceramic Arts Conference, and she completely offended 3,500 people. There were probably 500 that were excited, and the other 3,500 couldn't line up fast enough to the microphone to combat a presentation where she showed work that she said was in her backyard. Her backyard happens to be New York City. And she said, here's what I see in galleries. And the work she showed were examples of ceramics that were particularly haptic, squeezed, lumpy, what's often called derogatorily a sloppy craft. It was work that was made by people who don't have, in theory, you know, this undercurrent of skilling and craft. And there were people who literally got up and said they were offended because they had spent their lifetime perfecting a craft, that they now saw this work as somehow a slap in the face too. So I'm curious for those, especially for the two of you living in New York, and I know you've seen this work and you see it, what your thoughts are about what is a particular moment right now in ceramics and the kind of work that is being particularly heralded.
Well, I feel if you are naturally kind of skilled, you shouldn't fake it. And if you're not so naturally skilled, you can still make beautiful work, and that it's all valid, and that we shouldn't all be doing one kind of work. And I don't see what the problem is.
You were one of the 500.
I guess I would say, as another New Yorker who sees this stuff in the flesh fairly often, like Ruby Sterling, for example,
Correct.
an artist who's getting a lot of acclaim these days, makes these big kind of giant crucible-like cracked things and glazed with, very basic, and they're, very sort of appealing and sloppy, I guess you could call them. And I think there's room in the art world for all kinds of aesthetic. I don't think we need to limit and right now, what's in fashion in 3 minutes, blink and it'll be something else, So, I think the longer you're around, you see that. And I think there can be, when you look at the history of the training in ceramics and what attracts people to clay in programs, et cetera, sometimes it has been, and not necessarily in a positive way, the technical aspects of the medium. It's like there are photographers who just live for the darkroom and almost don't care what happens when it goes, the process is done. And I think when it's all about process for you, and that is, and not in the way that someone like John Roloff is using process for a kiln, let's say, where that's the concept, but that it's just about the superficial aspects of a work, and I don't think that's necessarily going to make a great work. And if someone spent their whole life doing that, and they're offended that somebody else chooses not to use those processes, I don't see why that should offend anybody. That's their choice, And if it expresses their ideas, well, let them have that room too, It's not so.
Sterling Ruby was one of the people I was thinking of, and also Ai Weiwei. And a lot of Chinese artists, but to me, that when I look at that work, it's more that they have a broad spectrum of media. It's an aspect of their work, so it gets contextualized within what they're trying to do, so to speak. And there's another layer to that, which is kind of not so much anti-craft, but it's this idea that when you finished art school, now you know what not to do. This idea you're training, and then there's sort of like and you're kind of organized in a certain way. And I mean, those are just different attitudes about that, and that the idea, that in itself may be a craft. The idea of how to be subversive in any way whatsoever, like in the New Genres department where I teach in San Francisco, the idea that we teach no craft. And I kept saying, Paul, you teach the craft of seeing. It's organizational things. It's sort of like, well, what do you mean by that? Well, we have a history of what we call craft, but that might be applied to many other things. It's really perspective. The same way that when I was in my first ceramic class, I'd go in the glaze room and there would be dolomite and feldspars and things in these bins, and I already knew them as part of a landscape. I knew what feldspar was as a certain percentage of a definition of granite, or in a certain part of the Sierra Nevadas, or however. And so the idea that it was now a white powder, and that white powder is essentially, if Kohler wasn't here and places like that, we wouldn't have that white powder. Because for us to go out and mine and mill down a bag of 200 mesh feldspar to be able to use it in a glaze, that cost us $10,000 to get that bag. But we're at the tail end of a whole industrial sort of process that allows those things to be cost effective and allows us to have access to them. So all these things are about perception and about perspective, and it depends on how you want to bring those ideas to it. I can't say that Sterling Rubin, because we've had him come as a visitor. He doesn't really think that way. He thinks more visually and very intuitively and very directly. So he's not like on some kind of program about it, at least in my mind. So again, there's just different ways to kind of define these things.
Could we open it up to a few questions? If people have questions from the audience. Yeah.
Ceramics. The initial ceramics that I saw seemed very French and European. And yes, and the rabbits have a very tactile feeling, and if you are around animals or not, there's that flexibility of the skeletal aspects of cats and rabbits and so forth. that's very endearing, and there's something about touching clay that makes you want to create the moment you touch it. There's something very magical about it. So I can see the love for that kind of material. The ships, I'm sorry, I have a very poor memory. I'm getting to that age. The ship seemed very intellectual to me, and more of the very current period, because it's so, well, it almost connects you with machines and what have you. And there is a mysterious quality about machines, how they work and what have you. And the biological aspects of the ceramic rather fascinated me, because it reminds me so much of current large pieces of things done in metal. And I think that I like all of the variety. I just can't, I'm itching to get a good glimpse of this exhibit. And I never thought of things in terms of ceramics. And I think it's just great. So, but I don't, as children, did you enjoy playing with clay or sanding, or were you always, itching to get your hands on something?
I think that's interesting that you say that that little detail about my work and the European influence. And I lived in England when I was 11, and it was the best year of my childhood. It was through some bizarre exchange. My father was a teacher, a public school teacher, and we went to live in England, and a family came and lived in our house. My dad exchanged jobs, and he had an American salary, but the dollar was really strong, so we were rich. And he took us out of school all the time. My parents took us out of school, and we went to look at castles and beautiful, amazing things. I fell in love with old things. I fell in love with the antique world, and I think it was also because my family was so happy that year. It was just unbelievable, like a summer vacation that never ended. And it was also incredibly surreal. Just light bulbs, the smell of a butcher, the taste of the milk, the toilet paper, everything was just slightly different. And I remember just loving that feeling. It was like kind of being on drugs, and I don't take drugs, but I imagine it was just slightly kind of different. And I feel like, I get very charged up around old things. And I would include modernist sculpture now.
Are there any other questions? Comments? Okay.
Well, one of the things you've kind of touched and walked around, but what's intrigued me about clay, and I should confess, I started out my field, my dissertation was 15th century Florentine painting and its relationship to humanism, so I've come a long way in the past 30, 40 years. But clay, one of you said that it has a wonderful quality and a porosity to it, visually. And that's something that strikes me, and it's tactile. I don't feel the same need to want to touch a bronze piece or a stone piece. There's kind of an intellectual jump from one to the other. I always think of bronze pieces or stone pieces, that there was an intellectual process that led to models or maquettes, which eventually gets translated into that final material, but the artist knowing what that final material is and what its limitations and its potentials are is always thinking about that. And what always, and the thing about, with clay, it's people made maquettes and there was a spontaneity, but spontaneity, let's say in the 19th century, was not allowed. It had to work through the mind. And and what's wonderful about clay, it seems to me, that in the past couple of decades, this spontaneity that's capable of coming through clay, the feel for the materials, is being allowed. And I read about a year and a half ago, and it really got me pretty upset. And I don't quote me on this. I think it may have been Roberta Smith who wrote it, that clay is the craft medium. And I really kind of turned off because there's a whole potential in clay that I don't think you can get anywhere else. I mean, it's not saying the other stuff is lesser. It's just different. It's unique. And this experience in the past few years of working on the exhibition has brought that home to me, and I've really gotten to value it. So it's not a craft medium. It's an artistic medium which has its own qualities and its own potential. And I think you've all really explored it. I've found it was exciting trying to figure out which works to put next to which and which works to pick out of the fairly extensive Hootkin collection. So this was a real eye-opening experience and a learning experience that I am really delighted to have had. And I thank all of you for the wonderful work that you've made.
Just about the material not being craft material, I think it's everything. I think it's both. Mm-hmm. And the difference between bronze or stone is that we don't touch it. We don't sit on it to poop. It's not involved in our daily life. Ceramics, there's the high and the low of that material, and I think that's what makes it so rich and wonderful.
And it reminded me of a moment, Russell, when you were speaking just then, when I first knew that I wanted to work in clay rather than bronze, because that was my background, was when I was going to school at Haverford College, and I visited the Rodin Museum in Philadelphia. And in the back room, they had Rodin's maquettes that were in terracotta. And I remembered seeing those and the absolute power and liveliness of being able to see where he had pushed it with his hands and manipulated it with his immediate sort of, moment was really, really fascinating to me. And then when I found out later that those maquettes were blown up by a team of people into the sculptures that you saw in bronze out front, it became interesting to see how that thumbprint became this really huge, godlike gesture in bronze. And what I wanted to do was to do those godlike gestures without having a team of assistants needing to blow it up for me. So this idea of taking the vitality and liveliness of that material and using it in this really big gestural Baroque way, like painters do, was what I really wanted out of the material itself. So it came from a traditional materialist background, but taking it to somewhere that I hadn't seen it do before.
Oh, we have one more in the back as well from Ari.
This will be a brief one, and then I'll pass it on. Somebody who buys art for the museum and has to acquire art. One artist in this show, who shall remain nameless for obvious reasons, created a small body of work and did a venture into casting it into bronze. And so, knowing the body was so small, I had no access to the clay work. And the question came up in my mind, do I buy the bronze piece? I could not bring myself to do it because somehow the essence of the thing was clay, the way it was done originally, and somehow it was simply the image of it that I was getting in bronze. I was not getting that clay original. So anyway, that's a comment. Who wanted this?
Thanks, Jerry. I feel like I have a lot of questions for everyone, but I want to ask Beth a question. And that is, can you discuss the conditions that surrounded making those objects in utter darkness at the beginning of your time in graduate. That was when it happened, right?
Yes,
And
the graduate. Let's see. Okay, how do I not tell a ginormous story? As I said, I'd been working with a human figure up until that point, and my background in working with a human figure was we studied from the model for 2-3 hour sessions every day, and we threw away our maquettes and our studies at the end of every session. And I did that for 4 years. So after 4 years, I didn't have a single piece in my portfolio, but that language of muscle, sinew, and bone was absolutely embedded in my brain. But what was also embedded in my brain was this idea that it was tied to this very white European bronze look. And so when I tried to break out of that and create pieces that had a more sort of personal and emotional context, I was really struggling with myself to do that. So it took creating, in some ways, some barriers, some rigid sets of rules that I would then fight to break out of. And one of them is that I decided I couldn't sculpt the human body anymore in a recognizable human form, so I had to disguise it as an animal. And then the other thing that I set up for myself was that I had to create these studies, in order that would only take me 45 minutes. And I wasn't allowed any more time than that. And then when that was still coming out really stiff and restrictive, I was like, all right, I can't even look at what I'm doing. So I filled my studio with 90 lawn leaf bags full of leaves and carved out a burrow in the middle of it. So it was just this little cave inside of this 12-foot by 12-foot studio. And I would disappear into this burrow for about 8 hours a day and just sculpt in the dark. And it was really feral and weird. But it was during a time when I definitely felt like I needed as many sort of hindrances to my tactile ability to create this other form. I needed to trip myself up over and over again until I had fought my way to something more interesting. And so those little... that was for 300 days. Yeah, so... sometimes 8 hours, not always, but it was a really intense period of basically, reclusion, of trying to systematically shut down this very structured way of learning and seeing.
Did you do any blind ears?
Blind ears? No, I didn't. But
I mean, it seems like the analog to
Yes.
not being able to see is to create
Yep.
the sound in some way.
Well, I spent quite a bit of time in graduate school working in the robotics department as well, because I really wanted to do interactive installation pieces, which I found out later I was really terrible at that. But one of the pieces I made was a piece in the dark that recorded the sounds of people interacting in that space. And I loved those tapes and the sounds of people moving through the darkness. And they were things that I was responding to later on. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, sure.
Russell, I've spent my probably adult life trying to fight that question that you ask about, is the bronze image different from the thing? And I fight it in the sense that it's a fascinating question to me. And I ask it all the time, like in certain contexts. And I want to fight the notion that somehow clay is more special than anything else, or different than anything else, or this is different than that. And it's a philosophical question as much as anything. And I love thinking back to the article all grad students or undergraduates read, and maybe they understand it or remember it and not, but Walter Benjamin's work of art, The Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which probably took me 15 years to actually understand what that thing was about reading it. And for me, it's the most heartfelt moment of crisis for somebody asking the question of what it means to have a reproduction of something, or something that we can capture in another way. And what does that mean? And is there any validity or truth in the notion that, like, this thing is special, like, versus 10 of her, or 10 copies, or, a painting and a really high-resolution photograph of it? We could say it's no different at all. You can completely understand both. There's no difference. And you could say, Easy. We get the DNR, the machine to, or we could say they're not. And when I read that essay, and I go back and read it probably once a year, because I think it's the most beautiful moment of someone grappling with this question. And then, of course, living with objects and experiencing objects and seeing them and knowing there is something different, like there's something about that thing, whatever, that's different, right? There's this, and even the language we use with ceramics of a skin, or when we talk about pottery, we talk about it as a body. There's a foot, a lip, a belly, right? It is so close to that physicality, and so it's fascinating what it means to say, like, well, these two look alike, but one somehow is different than the other. And I think it really is. It's like postmodernism wants us to say no different, right? The same image, whatever. But then there's this other more real side of it for me that says, wow, that's a huge question. Like,
Do you think that's
a
learned,
fascinating
though?
one.
Is that a societal value, or is that a intrinsic value in some way? Where would that come from? The idea of authenticity being, more
It's a really good
valuable.
question.
I think it has to do with an individual. Who cares is who wants
Yeah.
to get their hands in there. And we also said at lunchtime that clay, the interest in clay is always an ancient interest, that it's always been old, it's always been romantic. We don't need this material. We can do it in other ways. But people who are drawn to it will continue to be drawn to it. And it looks that way right now. Lots of people have caught on to clay.
I like what you said. You said clay was old 50 years ago, and Judy said clay was old 10,000 years ago.
It was.
Right? But there's all these
100.
moments.
That it's always old. Where
It's always old.
whoever's using, when Volkus used it was an old material. He did something amazing with it.
Right.
But it's always an old material. And I don't know. There's something heavy about this whole conversation, and it's sticky,
clay.
and it's like kind of gives me the creeps to be talking about clay with people. We're only talking about clay, and I can't wait to get out of here. In a way, it's like it is heavy. Clay
heavy.
it's a heavy, like in that we all share this. It's like, really. Let's do something else. Where's somebody working
Or there's
in
that
video?
line that somebody said, the best thing about clay is its history, and the worst thing about clay is its history. Or there's a weight to it, and for those of us who care about it or have questions about it.
Let me try one more thing. But don't you, at least over the years, I've sort of noticed that in doing lectures and stuff at a lot of different schools, that there's a certain group of people who are attracted to clay. And they're very often, at least in those days, so to speak, they weren't the people who were doing video. They were people who were doing something else. They weren't. So there's this kind of, and there was also this idea, which is particularly an NCICA thing and a university thing, is this community idea. And that it's multidimensional. And I mean, there is that, obviously, that attraction for sensuality and its directness. But it seems like it's also societal to me, or it's something about the type of people, the type of psychology and there's a wide variety within that, but it's just something I've noticed. I don't know if other people have or not.
Bruce?
John was just talking about, and the panel sort of is doing the green apple two-step around the whole idea of the romance of clay. I've taught
Right.
with Wrights for 21 years, and that's the kind of thing that came out of Alfred, unfortunately, and was in the East Coast. It seems to me like somebody asked Willie Mays one time, who was this baseball player that was probably one of the greats of his whole time. They asked him, well, what's your philosophy for baseball? And he said, they throw the ball, I hit it. They hit the ball, I catch it. It seems to me that whole idea of Russell was sort of talking about the romance of clay. Steve made a piece in clay, and it's pretty hard to make it stand up on one little leg there, and it looks wonderful in bronze. It works very nice in bronze. You know, when Pete stopped doing clay for a while, we were working in bronze and that sort of thing, and nothing seemed to change eventually. And it was like, you know, it's dirt basically, and it's a material as dumb as John said something about something dumb material. I mean, isn't gooey paint? That's pretty dumb, you know. But never anybody ever said that's a dumb material. You're really brilliant using this dumb material. So as I say, I'm just totally disturbed by the whole romance of clay. You know, it's sort of like, get over it. So maybe you have a reaction to that. I don't know. That wasn't quite a question. I just was worried about you.
Well, you probably couldn't have 4 people who are actually less concerned about it in some ways.
Right.
Um,
I think romance is a big draw.
I want romance.
It's a problem, but what I definitely have a romantic thing with clay, with wallpaper, with decorative arts. No, I get the romantic. I said it's a terrible thing, and one has to deal with it if you're afflicted like that. And I know that I am.
But Bruce, I would argue with you a little bit generationally, which is that I think that your generation did so much to shift the discussion where we didn't have to talk about it. And I am of the generation that actually wants to look at it and talk about it. Right? So and I don't mean that in an anti-intellectual way. I mean, you had, what did you call it, the green apple two-step, that you had to in some ways like get to this point where it was like, who cares? And in a way, I also could care less in many ways about the material of it, but I'm fascinated with how it's framed. Yeah.
The problem is you want it both ways.
Right.
You want to say there's a bunch of ceramic critics, and there's a bunch of painting critics, and yet you say, boy, I'm doing the same thing they're doing, but we really love our ceramic critics. It's like, wait a minute, you can't have it both ways. Yeah, I mean, if you love the ceramic critics, that's wonderful, but if you're at the same time on the other side of your mouth saying, I'm just as good as that painter, and my work should be looked at like that painter, then, as I said, there's not 2 ways you deal with this. It doesn't seem to me. It seems to me you're copping out.
I don't get that.
I have something to say. I think I've thought about that over the years, you know, the kind of people clamoring for different kinds of attention from different groups. And my thinking at the present is that change is slow, and it comes in a lot of different forms, and it doesn't all come in the perfect way you would wish. As a young woman, I was one of the very few people in my program. I'm so happy to say now there are lots of women in the field. But there was a time when I was younger where I felt I would never be in a show that isolated women in a ghetto and called it a women's ceramic show or a clay sculptors or anything to do with the word woman, because I thought, well, that's just continuing the segregation and the separation, and it should be the opposite. And then at a certain point, now I can look back and say, I'm happy to be in a show that celebrates women. And maybe I can do that now because of this sort of argument that was made earlier. And I don't know if we need to, you know, say it can only come from one place. I think that it can happen that change is going to come a little bit here and it chips away in one way and it comes there. And, you know, maybe sometimes it's not always the ideal form, but over time there have been shifts, and thank God for that, right? I mean, at least there's movement and change, and I think that it will continue to be the case. So, that's my thinking.
I've been really lucky personally in that I've gotten to show my work in non-ceramic, contexts, and particularly working with the Claire Oliver Gallery. It was just an art gallery. There were people doing video and performance and painting and object making, and I was definitely the only person working in clay. And what was great about that is people coming into the gallery would look at these pieces and say, "Wow, what is that?" And it almost showcased the material in a way that that made it more unique than being in a whole gallery with other ceramic artists or whatnot. So, my education was the same way. I went to Ohio State University for graduate school, and I was one of the only people coming out of there making fired objects. I mean, lots of people went on to video and performance and other materials. And what was nice is that coming from ceramics really just meant that we understood what it was to choose a material and to hear its voice for what kind of unique flavor it brought to that particular work. And so I continue to work with clay because that particular voice is appropriate for what I'm saying. But I think that we have a sensitivity to materials that's brought all of us into different medium, like the rubber and the wallpaper and the geologic aspects of the material and the firing and the body. I mean, all these things are about sensing the material and how it can take us in different directions. So I think really the conversation has moved, at least from my perspective, beyond this sort of material-centered thing, and has become more of an interesting, like, why? What does that material have to say that's unique in this point? And that's where I feel quite privileged to be in showing at the moment.
Ceramics is really about the object. Quite often it's hard to deal with clay without dealing with an object. And so I think the show really reflects the idea of ceramic artists or people who work in clay in dealing with the objects in this intensely personal narrative that the show as a whole reflects. And I think it would be hard to have such a strong show that's so narrative and so personal in other mediums, because it's three dimensions, because there's this personal quality in the fingerprints that sometimes you can see in the play. And I think all your work really reflects this personal quality that you get from an object, that reflects back in ceramic history. And that's really different from the first slide that Paul showed at the Bray with Locus and Rudy Gaudium and Bernard Leach, that the object was there but without personal narrative, or with very little personal narrative.
I think that has a lot to do with the fact, though, that you're seeing that every piece in the show is through the lens of the Hootkins, and they were attracted to that specific. Yes, they're green M&M. You're seeing a whole collection of green M&Ms here, and they, in my conversations with Steve and Pam, like they're really drawn to those moments of intense, personal, and even transgressive, moments that are captured in these pieces. I mean, each of us have made, hundreds of works, but it were these particular pieces that the Hootkins were drawn to because they were moments that that the Hootkins were drawn to that had that specific element that you're referring to. So it's interesting from that perspective. I mean, I do humorous pieces that are funny and light, and pieces that are, dark and depressing, and pieces that are scary. I mean, there's a whole range, but what you're seeing are these one particular pieces that were drawn into this larger collection. And I think that's what's interesting about looking at it, is that it's subconsciously thematic in that sense.
One final comment. I
Yeah.
love this thing about the green M&Ms. But there's about 37 artists in the show, and everybody's got personality and individuality. And so my comment would be there are a lot of shades of green.
Russell, that's such a good place to end.
Yes.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you. Good night.